Hi, I'm Len Apcar, who was editor of the New York Times website from 2002 to 2006. In those years, we did a tremendous amount of experimentation, innovation, and other things to try to figure out how to use the digital medium to best tell stories. It was a really kind of a big moment in the New York Times website era because broadband had come into the American home. It wasn't just in American offices. It was also in public places. And although we didn't have mobile broadband to the extent, certainly to the extent we had now, we did have the ability to put broadband at your fingertips in almost any setting if you had a laptop. That opened up all sorts of horizons for us. And Naka Nathaniel, who is the multimedia editor at the website and really the chief inspiration for so much of the innovation that we did in storytelling in the United States and abroad, including the Iraq War and even going back to the 9/11 attack and the 9/11 remembrances. Naka became a kind of industry pace setter, setting the stage for a number of different ways to tell stories in the digital medium. And it was a huge hit. It became a moneymaker because advertisers supported it. And as a consequence, it was really the kind of the beginning of the era for using photography, audio, and eventually video on the website. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Naka. We're going to invite him in a second to join us. And he's going to talk a little bit about how he thought about story conception and the use of these tools to tell stories. This was our mantra, to tell stories in ways the paper cannot. Naka, are you there?
Yes.
I don't see you yet. There you are.
Sure.
So the way this works is in this new format the way this works on a Hangout is that when you speak, the camera picks you up. Whereas it used to be more not long ago in the old format, I had to manually move it back and forth. So you can't be shy, Naka. We want to see you. So when you talk, well, there you are. All right. See, well, there you are. We'll see you. So let's kick it off. Let's go back to all the way back to 9/11 for a moment and talk a little bit about one of the most famous videos you captured.
Right. Yeah. We have been doing work around things that were, planned out, fashion shows, a lot of cooking, things that, had a audience that we could reliably count upon. And it happened to be Fashion Week in New York. So I had the gear with me. We'd shot a Marc Jacobs show over on the West Side late at night, and I had returned to my home in Brooklyn, and that's when woke up in the morning to the listening to the radio and heard that something had happened downtown. Ran upstairs, and I happened to have my tripod since we had been up on the risers at the fashion show shooting, and set up the tripod and set up the camera and hit record, and the first plane had already hit. Was just so much paper up in the sky and the smoke that you could see, and that's when, shock of all shocks, the second plane came swooping in, and I had it on the grabbed the camera and said goodbye to my wife, who jumped on one of the last subways, and she was working with the New York Times. She was one of the website editors, and so she caught one of the last trains in, and I jumped on my bike and I rode down to the promenade and filmed down there until the North Tower collapsed and all of the debris came across the East River. And I had been regular biker, so I knew that the Brooklyn Bridge path was going to be blocked, but there was a new path across the Williamsburg that I knew that I could jump on, and like a salmon swimming upstream, was able to get across into Manhattan, and then up to the newsroom where, we were able to. Jeff McGee and some other folks helped me grab the tape, make screen captures, and that's what we used as the image on the homepage, and then the video was shared with ABC and CNN, and both of them put them in RAW, and unfortunately, it was not as profound as I would like to have been, and I yelled out "Holy shit" instead of something as clear as "Oh, the humanity," and so Peter Jennings had to apologize on air for the coarse language that the person on camera used.
So Peter Jennings of ABC News used it that night as part of or probably live that day.
That morning, yeah. So everything was done. It had all happened at 8:40, 8:50, 8:45, 8:50.
Right.
And I had gotten into the newsroom, and by about 10:30 or so, and it was shared, shortly after that. The Times had a relationship at that point with ABC. We have been doing programming, video programming between the two, between the network and the newspaper.
So from that moment forward, how did you think about video on one hand and multimedia and digital storytelling as in a broader way?
That's a great question. Yeah, it was one of those things that while the video was really important, it was obvious that the delivery system wasn't going to be the internet at that point. It really was television, and the most we could make with those images was a small, take screenshots and then put it into Real Player. There really was no outlets, digitally, because broadband wasn't up to speed. It
was slow. It was slow. It was like I say, it was rolling out into American kitchens. It was still slow.
Yeah. And so video really was not the delivery system. But what we did know is that we had other tools at our disposal, primarily cameras. Doing photography. The Times had a spectacular core of photographers, and we really partnered up with them and came up with these marvelous little photo journals, which we would record the photographers and then put their images up against their narration, and that was really the audio slideshow template that our team, our multimedia team, was really able to take advantage of.
Good. Now, one of the things that became kind of emblematic of that period was the use of flash. It was still photography with audio on top of it, graphics, other things that were allowed you to tell stories in really interesting ways, and sometimes to even kind of make the kind of fool a reader who was or a user who was not totally cognizant of the technology, that we weren't using video. We were using flash, which didn't require so much bandwidth, but did give us a fair amount of flexibility for storytelling. We expanded that in many ways, not just with features like cooking and fashion and books and whatnot, but we also used it in a news way. For instance, in 2003, you went to the war in Iraq, starting first in Kuwait. Talk a little bit about how you used it then.
Right. Yeah, we had a very talented Flash developer named Jeff McGee, who we worked with developing a lot of templates with him, and he really came up with this, ingenious way of, here's the format, just plug in, your content. And so that's really what freed us up to concentrate less on the programming and more on the what I mean by computer programming, and actually concentrate on the journalism that was going into the template. And that was one of the great things about the team that we had. Judith and Brent, who were doing photos, and Lisa Tazi, who was helping us out with the content, was that really freed us up to really concern ourselves with the journalism. So much of the stuff before was developing the technology, developing the distribution system, and by the time came around to the Iraq element, we were already able to quickly, take material, record, gather up the stories that we wanted to tell, and then to distribute them through the Flash templates.
Uh, think for a moment about the way in which you thought about story possibilities and conceptualized, if you will, the way you use the medium. Once we had the program down and kind of understood what the assets were and what we could use from the Times, talk a little bit about what in your daydreaming moments, how you would conceptualize or envision certain stories.
Right. Yeah. It always started with, what was the audience? How would we, try and like, who are we trying to speak to? I mean, obviously, yeah, one of our missions was to try and broaden, the Times's audience, and really take advantage of the fact that so many young people were flocking to the internet, that they weren't subscribing to the newspaper. And so that was one of our core things, is, to understand that, or at least what our perception was of what that audience was going to be. And, my thing that I always had in the back of my head was, I have a much younger brother, who's 13 years younger than I am. And I would, how would I tell this story to him? Because, he's at home, on the laptop, or, actually on the desktop back then. And, he probably has an IM session open. He probably has, his textbook, with his homework, on his lap. And, he probably has a TV on in the corner, and of course, the family dog, is down at his feet. So he has all these things going on. Like, how would we possibly tell, this story? And of course, it was all about this multitasking that was, big around that time. And of course, a lot of that stuff is then debunked, about the ability to multitask. But that's really what we were thinking, is, okay, how do we come at somebody, with a, to fully engage their attention, by telling a cohesive story using photos, text, using audio. And the audio element was one of those things that, as it happened, I grew up on this small little island that didn't have TV. And so I grew up listening to a lot of radio, and listening to old television programs. And so I had always been very audio oriented. And it was, that part that, when you slap on a pair of headphones and you would start listening through pieces, that's really the sneaky thing that ended up happening. Is that, we found these bits of audio, and the power of audio is so incredible. Just recently, in the States, of course, with the stories going on down on the border, this sound clip of the ProPublica, the audio, the little
good point, very good point.
Yeah, so that's the crucial thing, is that people, of course, we're all seem to be very visually oriented people, but one of the base things is always the audio. And it's one of those things that I became more and more cognizant of, like listening to the pitch in somebody's voice, listening for those moments of just, the emotion that comes across, and that's the other part too, is, just as visually, things are universal, audibly, things can also be just as universal, in the cry in somebody's voice, the sorrow, or the elation, is something that if you have that element, that's really, that's next level,
right.
That's next level storytelling.
Right. One of the very early things we did with Flash and audio and photos were audio slideshows, and 8 pictures, 12 pictures, 15 pictures, maybe at most. We would put audio, generally of a reporter who had covered the story or was at the scene, and overlay that with still photographs that were coming in, either from Times photographers or from Reuters or the Wires, and occasionally a piece of video. But that became a high volume storytelling device. Let's go back, if you will, to what you did during Iraq. There you had photos, you also had audio, you had some visuals, and you did this every day. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. Yeah, I was in Kuwait City, and that's where the Times was quarterbacking the coverage out of. It was too difficult to do it out of Baghdad, and there was a good core of people that were stationed in Kuwait. And when you do these types of projects, you do need the connective tissue, and that was one of the things that just as television has figured this out by having an anchor person. And so we ended up doing that by having the chief correspondent, journalist named Patrick Tyler, who had a very clear voice, very good presence. And he was doing the summary for the lead all for the paper. And since he was speaking to so many people, what would happen is that since we had stable phone connections in Kuwait, is Pat would talk to someone traveling to Najaf or in Baghdad, and then immediately after he was done with them, we would switch over the phone. And I had recording devices set up with the phone, and he would transfer the call over to me, and I would do a short interview with the correspondent. And that was just great element of just being there and being able to produce in the field. That's really what was able to, because I had the rest of the equipment. It was just that, like I said, the connective tissue, like knowing what story we wanted to tell, what was the broad overview, and then being able to inject, the different voices of the correspondents that were, on satellite phones, or, if they had stable connections that they could, that we could record the audio. And then I would take since we were on a great, great internet connection in Kuwait City, I could easily pull the photos that were coming across the server, and then tie that all together with drop it in the template, and then publishing it from Kuwait.
I remember this ran as a module on our homepage every day. I think it was called the Iraq briefing.
Yeah, the war briefing. Yeah.
War briefing. And it also enabled the user to click. You didn't just go from A to Z. You could click around, right, to get various aspects of the story told if you were short on time. And I think the total time package, what would you estimate? Was it about 12 to 15 minutes?
Yeah, it was about 12 to 15 minutes. And the reason, we had, one of the things that we had kind of struck out upon is letting people know what the full context of the story was, what the chapters were, rather than just the slow, just stick with us, we'll keep your attention. Is that we wanted people to know what was coming up next, and just having the, for lack of a better term, the rundown. It's the thing that you now see on, sports like a PTI.
Right.
They use the rundown, and it's just, when you look at nonlinear storytelling, that was just one of those devices that we really wanted to take advantage of. There were these old books that I read growing up called Choose Your Own Adventure, and that was kind of the shared language that Lisa Tazi and a couple of the other producers that I was working with, is that we were all familiar with these these little chapter books where you got to the end of 2 or 3 paragraphs and you got to decide what happened next. And that's really kind of the idea that we had in the back of our heads is let the reader choose, like let the viewer choose where they're going next. This is how we're going to differentiate ourselves from television or radio, which are purely linear things. And it's also one of the things that happens in newspapers, that you get to choose when you have the physical print paper in front of you, you get to choose where you go next. And so that was the element that we really wanted to take advantage of, was to give somebody control.
It was a good point. It was the serendipity, really, of using multimedia. Fast forward a little bit to a few years. You eventually went off with Nick Kristof to various stories. There was the women trafficking story. There was North Korea. There was pieces done from China. There, you didn't quite know always what the story was going to be, but you just knew you were accompanying Nick on a mission, on a story, fact-finding story, to these places. How did you think about on the fly, really, and on the trip, what you were going to do?
That was one of the great things that being partnered, and when you partnered Nick and I up on this, and it was one of those, it was fantastic, just such a great idea to partner us, because while we had figured out some things with Iraq, it really was getting on the ground. Is we had developed, not only did we have the technology down, but then I was also developing the backpack, which we jokingly called the future of journalism, which had the the television, or which had the camera, the video camera, the still camera, had a satellite connection that I could use from just about anywhere, the laptop and the audio recording gear, and it all fit into a backpack. And as long as I had my gear with me, I could easily get a story back to the editors in New York. And the thing with Nick is that, Nick he had traveled so much, and he was so familiar, with his stories, and being an opinion columnist, that he had a lot of extra leeway that most journalists didn't. And so even if there wasn't a clear-cut story, there was a broad overview that I knew that we could pull together. And we weren't going to the places where most journalists were going, and that was one of the things that we really wanted to take advantage of. Take advantage of having a spotlight that we could show wherever. So when we went to Darfur, there was an obvious story there. That there was the genocide that was going on, and the humanitarian crisis. That was a story that that we could really delve into really, really deeply, and tell stories that that made a difference. And that was the same thing too when we went up to Alaska for the first time. That was our first really getting paired up, and he had a notion of let's go show this is not a one of the early Secretary of the Interior's Gail Norton called it a great white nothingness up there, and we went up there and showed that no, there is something here, that there's there's beautiful vistas, there's huge caribou herds, there's polar bears, muskox, that this is really a part of the world that needs to be preserved. And that was one of the hopefully we weren't necessarily the loudest voice, but we were definitely a voice that that led to the restrictions against drilling in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so that was the thing.
Briefly, how did you work in Alaska? You had no power. You had no broadband. How did you work?
So what ended up happening is that we found our
phone signal. I don't remember.
So Nick had to file his story. So we were able to hook up a satellite phone to his laptop, and we pulled off. We did a hiking and rafting trip, and it was there were three of us, and we would just pull off on a gravel bank, and Nick would pull out the laptop and I'd help him hook up the satellite connection, and then we would transmit back to New York. And so we were able to, but we didn't have the cohesive story quite yet. So we waited until we had reached the the Arctic Ocean. And once we got up there, got to a town called Kaktovik, and I was able to record Nick. And this is what happened on our journey. This is what we learned. And really, again, it's when you start telling the story, you have to know, kind of where you're going and what sort of And this is the journalism aspect of it. You have to know what your story is going to be. And by the end of the trip, we definitely did know what our story was. And Nick was able to sit down, and I had some great photos. The imagery was really strong. Paired it up with Nick's narration, and I had to wait until I got back to Fairbanks, Alaska, to be able to actually transmit it back to me.
You did more than one piece, didn't you? Or was it just one big feature?
We did one big feature. We also did a couple sidebars. One was on an Inupiat community that had just happened to be, they pulled in a whale while we were there, and so we did a short report about that.
What in kind of rolling this all up now and looking back on those years, what tips would you have today for storytellers who now have so much technology, a wider audience, a more kind of educated audience who's familiar with web technology and online news and features? Well, what advice would you give to young producers, videographers, audio producers, podcast people? What parting advice do you have for how to tell stories?
So I would definitely say, just as it was when we were telling stories, it's still an exciting time to be doing this. And one of the things that we, in hindsight, realized that, be patient with this stuff, keep trying stuff, experiment, and recognize that, you may not be the person that necessarily figures it out, but you may drop the breadcrumb for the next person to come along. It's one of those things that when we had first started doing a lot of this work 15, more than 15 years ago, is that we did not, we did a lot of stuff that was proto podcasting. A lot of the stuff that was proto short form video. Then what we were kind of waiting around, what we didn't have necessarily was the distribution system. Like we did not, we could not anticipate what was going to happen with iPhones. That was my large backpack became an iPhone. That's the distribution system really changed, and people are still when we were developing this stuff, like you actually had to sit down and you had to listen at your desktop. Now you can wash the dishes and listen to a podcast, or you can be in your car doing your commute, and that's one of the beauties of the early work. It's some people will joke that had known me way back when, saying oh yeah, you guys started the podcasting stuff, and it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if you wanted to say that, but because there were many people who came along, and just as we stood on the shoulders of others, recognize that someday you'll be the base of support for what comes next. So experiment, like try, don't listen to the folks that say there's no way that this is going to work right now, because you can't anticipate what's going to happen next. We can't anticipate what sort of technology or distribution will come along next, and just the way to tell strong stories. I mean, it's still all about the stories.
Good. Naka's too modest to mention this, but in that era, the New York Times website really was a pace setter for not only newspaper websites, but online sites around the world in terms of multimedia storytelling and using all these tools to tell stories visually, orally, and in different ways to kind of give you a perspective on how the story came together and what it was like to be in Alaska or Iraq or in some of the other exotic and sometimes not so exotic places where we were just telling stories that kind of lifted itself off the page. The Times website in that era won just about every, or maybe every, major award for multimedia, opinion writing, photography, feature writing, on and on and on. And it did it on the strengths not only of the great reporting and writing of the New York Times newsroom, no question about it, but then, as I used to say, they would hand us a big block of marble every night and we would sculpt it into a beautiful statue. And Naka was really at the forefront of all of that with a small team. It was not very large. People think of the New York Times as being a small army, but it was a really tiny multimedia group that became very focused on what they needed to do and very talented. And with that, it just took off. I'll go back. I'll end right here, but I will go back now to the class discussion and talk a little bit about some of these pieces that Naka referred to. Thanks.
Thanks, Len.
Thank you, Naka.
I really appreciate the kind words.
Absolutely.